When you think of learning, most people think of school, classes, or seminars at work. But humans are constantly learning and adapting, even though they may not even realize it a lot of the time. Today's topic is going to take us back in time to look at how some psychological concepts that were developed over the last 100 years or so have been modified and are used in literally every video game you can think of. These concepts are classical conditioning and operant conditioning, and while the simplest way to explain them are with examples of training dogs, your favorite games are teaching you to roll over and speak more than you may realize. Classical conditioning was developed by Ivan Pavlov back in 1905, and his famous experiment was literally him training his dog Circa. The basic concept of this is that the initial interaction is the dog smells the food and begins to drool in preparation to eat. In this case, the food is the unconditioned stimulus, and the drooling is the unconditioned response. But Pavlov wanted to see if the food was even necessary to create this response, and so he began to condition his pup using the sound of a bell. Rather than just preparing the food and placing it in front of the dog, Pavlov would ring the bell, then prepare the food and place it out in front. At first, Circa had no idea what was happening with the bell, but over time began to realize that the bell always rang before being fed, and began to associate the sound of the bell with getting food in addition to the smell of the food itself. Eventually, Pavlov could just ring the bell and the dog's brain would think, "Oh, I'm being fed," and the slobber would start pouring out the same way it would have if the dog actually had the food in front of it. This was one of the most famous psychological concepts in history, and Pavlov devoted his life to determining the principles of this concept, even winning the Nobel Prize for his discovery. But the way we've adapted this conditioning to manipulate humans has been the driving force behind loads of decisions made in television, marketing, and yes, even video games. Take the Legend of Zelda series, for example. Early on in these games, there are typically a ton of cutscenes, a lot of dialogue, and opportunities to get important items that will help you on your journey. You open a chest or talk to an NPC, a little jingle plays, and you get the slingshot, or the boomerang, or whatever tool will help you progress. And that progression triggers the reward center of your brain, making you feel good. Let's focus on the jingle that plays though, as that is going to be our conditioned stimulus in this example, while the acquisition of the item will be our unconditioned stimulus. When you open a chest or receive an item, the jingle is consistent throughout the game, and you hear it over and over again every time you pick something up, until eventually the item you get doesn't even matter anymore. It could be something absolutely useless to you at that point of the game, but the sound you hear causes your heart rate to pick up, and you get a spike of anticipation for what could possibly be hiding in that random corner you checked. And congratulations, you have been trained by an electronic box. The stimulus that causes your enjoyment is no longer only seeing the item that you got, but it is now also linked to hearing the noise that signals you are about to receive something. The reason developers have begun to include more of these triggers is for the end goal of making you enjoy the game, even if it does kind of seem like you're being tricked. Those little spikes in enjoyment make your brain think you're having a great time playing this game, even if you may have just spent loads of time wandering around trying to figure out what to do next, and the item you got might not be what you were looking for. It makes you more likely to continue playing and have good memories surrounding whatever game you currently have loaded. This adaptation is largely subconscious and will frequently happen without players even realizing it. But our next concept is something a bit more in your face, to the point where it's basically a conscious decision to be trained. This one is known as operant, or instrumental conditioning, and it's a bit more complicated than just ringing a bell before you feed your dog. Operant conditioning was an idea developed by B.F. Skinner in 1948 and revolves around four main ideas: positive reinforcement, positive punishment, negative reinforcement, and negative punishment. The reinforcement groupings were conditions that would cause a certain behavior to become more likely, while punishment groupings would cause a certain behavior to become less likely. Positive refers to adding a stimulus, while negative refers to taking one away. This can get a little bit confusing, but it's easier to think of it that positive doesn't mean good, it just means add, while negative doesn't mean bad, it means take away. Skinner came up with this theory using a series of boxes with mice in them. For example, to test positive reinforcement, the box had a button in it that the mouse would push, and then food would be dispensed into the box, teaching the mouse that if you press this button, good things happen. While for positive punishment, if the mouse steps into the wrong corner of the box, then the floor shocks them, teaching it that if you go into that corner, bad things happen. The opposite works for the other ideas. Like for negative reinforcement, the floor is constantly shocking a mouse, but if they press a button, it stops, showing that the button takes away the bad thing. And for negative punishment, if the mouse presses the button, their food gets taken away, showing that undesirable behaviors like pushing the button remove a good thing. These conditioning methods have the ability to either encourage or discourage specific actions, and the mice tended to learn quickly due to the immediate responses caused by their actions. This feels like it's a lot more complicated to use for training than classical conditioning, but actually, operant conditioning is present constantly while playing video games, as the player is basically always being either rewarded or punished for their decisions within a game. Fail to dodge at the right time in Dark Souls? That's positive punishment, you're going to be taking a hit. Manage to perform a quick time event properly? That's positive reinforcement, and you're allowed to move on with your adventure. Decide to give a Goomba a hug instead of jumping on its head? That's negative punishment, and you are going to be losing a power-up that could have helped you later on in the level. Pull off a risky jump to take a shortcut? That's negative reinforcement, because you don't have to do all the bits that you skipped that could have ended up costing you big time. The fact that these rewards and punishments happen instantly makes a huge difference in how the player learns. Video games often come with tutorials that are meant to teach you the game's mechanics, but nobody wants to play an hour-long tutorial that covers literally everything in the game, and so operant conditioning's inclusion allows players to constantly be learning without an in-depth explanation of what they need to do in order to finish the game every 30 seconds. The hand-holdy nature of being openly trained rather than it happening in the background is a huge reason for some of the complaints about recent Pokemon games. So the best way game developers can go about this is to teach gamers things without them even realizing it's happening. That's just for single-player games, where the devs have to think ahead to determine how players will respond to new threats. Operant conditioning is even more prevalent in multiplayer games. Whether it's a fighting game, a shooter, or a strategy game, players are always head-to-head and learning from one another. Fast-paced fighting games require minute adaptations to your opponent's playstyle, knowledge, and ability in order to succeed. In Super Smash Bros., going for an option that's not safe on shield and getting punished for it will teach you not to go for it again, or else the same scenario will play out. Whereas seeing someone constantly jumping from the ledge and adapting to it with your own punish and response will serve as positive reinforcement, as it adds another tool to your arsenal against your opponent. Shooters like Valorant will have players who always peek the same spots, and if they die there twice in a row, they're supposed to realize, hey, maybe I should stop doing that, acting as a form of negative punishment because they lose their ability to play their game for that round. Although I'm not sure people in my elo actually have the ability to learn from their mistakes. Every time one player recognizes that they were punished for doing something and changes their playstyle, their opponent will then have to adapt to the new action if they end up being punished in return, causing multiplayer games to be a constant, fascinating push and pull of learning and adapting between opponents until one of them ends up taking the win. Gamers can come to crave being conditioned like this, as getting a good result or adapting properly to someone's change in play feels so insanely good that it's actually addictive. The reward center that activates in your brain will light up while playing video games, and the rush of feel-good chemicals that come from reacting to something properly are the same as the ones you get from eating a good meal or doing drugs. This is a large part of why humans love gaming so much, but in the end, we're all just animals being trained by a box filled with numbers. That's all I have for you today though. Be sure to subscribe if you thought this was interesting. Thank you for watching, and I will catch you later.